we rolling? We
Yeah.
are. First question.
Okay, you calm me down a little bit.
Okay.
But wait a minute, I got to take a deep breath.
You're gonna do fine. You're gonna do fine.
Now, you're not going to get my legs, so can I cross my
No,
legs?
yeah,
I can cross my legs and I'll feel,
You're
okay,
fine.
okay.
First question I ask everybody is give me your first and last name and then spell it for me, please. And let me calm these folks down out here.
Okay.
I know it's after hours, but they- Okay, first question I ask everybody is give me your first and last name and then spell your first and last name for me.
I'm all right, everything's all right now?
Yes, you're fine, but put your hands down and smile about it.
Okay, all right.
Okay, first and last name and then spell it for me, please.
Savannah Potter Miller. Savannah Potter-Miller.
Okay, now, I want you to give me a brief personal profile for each attorney from Halliwell, Ward, Moore, and Alexander. Start with Donald Halliwell. When did you work for him, and tell me about the man.
Donald Halliwell is the premier civil rights attorney who assembled a team of lawyers from America, all over America, to help represent people in the civil rights struggle. Donald Halliwell practiced law in his own law firm at 859.5 Hunter Street, initially with Horace Ward, who became the first African-American federal judge. Vernon Jordan was brought in initially, secondly, after Horace Ward, and then the law firm became Halliwell, Ward, Moore, Halliwell, Ward, and Moore, Howard Moore. Howard Moore is also a very brilliant attorney. Later, the law firm became Moore Alexander, Howard Moore, it became Moore Alexander and Renskoff after Mr. Halliwell accepted the presidential appointment to become the regional director, the first African-American regional director of a federal agency through his presidential appointment.
Now, tell me about Mr. Halliwell. How long did you work for him? Were you intimidated at any time? Come on in, Phyllis. Stop for a minute. Thank you. Thank you. Have a great weekend. Thank you.
Can we do that over again?
Yeah, we're on tape.
It was all right?
Yeah, it's on tape.
Okay,
Mhm.
I mean, it was all right?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's on tape. So I mean,
Okay.
you know, let's take it from the top. Okay.
Okay.
And so we are rolling. First question I asked, we've already answered that. Give me a brief personal profile about each attorney from Halliwell, Ward, Moore, and Alexander. And you just explained to me that it went through a series of changes. What was the original law firm?
The original law firm was Donald L. Halliwell and Horace T. Ward. That was because Mr. Halliwell initially represented Horace T. Ward, who later became the first African-American federal judge in the United States District Court for the Northern District of Georgia. He represented Horace T. Ward in his unsuccessful application for admission to the University of Georgia Law School. Mr. Horace T. Ward then went on to graduate from law school in Chicago and later came back and worked in the law firm with Donald Halliwell at 859.5 Hunter Street.
Okay, now you also mentioned the name Vernon Jordan. I didn't know that he worked with Donald Halliwell. Can you tell me about that?
Vernon Jordan says that his job, when 1 week after he graduated from law school, he came to work for Mr. Halliwell. And then Mr. Halliwell was his mentor, and he was his mentee. And Vernon Jordan says that he carried Mr. Halliwell's briefcase. He drove Mr. Halliwell around in his car. He did research with Mr. Halliwell, and he loved Donald L. Halliwell.
Everybody seemed to have loved this man. And and he was a good attorney, which means that he had a hard streak to him. What did you learn from him?
Mr. Halliwell was more than a good attorney. He was a Shakespearean speaker. He was a very tall man. He had played football in Lane College, was a football player. But most importantly, he had served 2 tours of duty in the United States Army. In fact, he was in the Buffalo Soldiers. So he served in World War II in a segregated armed forces. He later was promoted and at one time was the only black officer in his entire platoon or brigade. He did a tour overseas, and then he came back. He had married Mrs. Halliwell and came back and decided then he wanted to go to law school, according to the book that he's written, and that Mrs. Halliwell and Mr. LaFelt have written, that is, called The Sacred Call. But Mr. Halliwell decided he wanted to, because of his military experience, that he had to come to Georgia, where Mrs. Halliwell lived, and to develop a reputation to assist in the civil rights struggle. Now, initially, after President Johnson had signed the 1964 Civil Rights Act, Mr. Halliwell found himself representing students who were testing the law, who had been thrown out of restaurants in Georgia, the Pickwick restaurant, Lester Maddox, who later became the governor of the state of Georgia, unfortunately took a bat, I believe it was, and Mr. Halliwell represented those students, and later it was determined by the courts that there was a violation of law. But not only did he represent students in civil rights matters, Mr. Halliwell was a profound criminal defense lawyer. He represented several people, and many people, but several of his cases were so severe because he represented African Americans who were indicted for raping or killing Caucasian people. And several of those cases were before all-white juries, and some of those cases, the juries found Mr. Halliwell's client not guilty. Of course, he had to file appeals in many of the criminal cases, but his profound appearance, his deep, resonant voice. Howard Moore talks about a case in Macon, Bibb County, where the police officer shot a young man several times in the back of the head. Mr. Halliwell eventually came to the coroner's inquest, and his cross-examination of the police officer was so profound that when Mr. Halliwell finished with the police officer was crying because he admitted shooting an unarmed young black man in the back of the head. Mr. Halliwell challenged a very racist judge in Fulton County, Judge Durwood Pye, P-Y-E. Judge Pye questioned Mr. Halliwell on numerous occasions, and in one brilliant move having to do with the students who were picketing to promote the civil rights movement, Mr. Halliwell found a remotely used federal Georgia statute which allowed the cases to be transferred to federal court. So on one occasion when the case was reset the next day for Judge Pye, Mr. Halliwell continued to ask the judge, could it be heard? He said, no, you cannot be heard. So Mr. Halliwell raised the question, Your Honor, would the court be interested in me raising a question? And the court allowed him to raise the question. He said, would the court be interested in knowing that this court does not have jurisdiction anymore because the federal court has accepted jurisdiction and this state court has no longer jurisdiction? Mr. Halliwell was brilliant. He assembled a team of Constance Baker Motley from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in Washington, lawyers from around the United States. Of course, Ms. Constance Baker Motley became the first black woman federal court judge in the federal court in New York. Lawyers just came from everywhere to assist Mr. Halliwell while he represented persons not only in civil rights, but a tremendous criminal defense lawyer.
Wow, I didn't even know that. Talk to me about Horace Ward.
Horace T. Ward became the first judge of record in the judicial system in the state of Georgia. Initially, he was appointed as a civil court judge under the state system, that is for misdemeanor cases, except his cases were civil litigation. Later, he was appointed as a superior court judge for the Atlanta Judicial Circuit, which is also called Fulton County. I had the distinct honor of being sworn in as the first African-American woman prosecutor in the state of Georgia by Judge Horace T. Ward on January 15, 1978. On or about December the 7th, 1978, Judge Horace Ward was sworn in as a federal judge, the first African-American federal judge for the United States District Court for the Northern District of Georgia. And that was primarily because Mr. Halliwell had had a conference with Griffin Bell, who had become Attorney General of the United States, and asked Attorney Griffin Bell, to impress upon President Carter that it was time for African Americans to have judgeships or to rise to the level of judgeships in the state of Georgia. So Horace T. Ward became the first African American federal judge for the state of Georgia. Horace T. Ward is still alive. He still is around at all Bar Association meetings. His reputation is profound, and also he tutored me on the bar exam for the Georgia bar. I was admitted to the New Jersey bar, and Judge Ward agreed to tutor me privately. I was his only student in real estate law because his practice in the law firm of Halliwell, Ward, and Moore and Alexander was primarily in real estate. Very profound real estate attorney.
Now, I have a name here, A.T. Walden, and he wasn't a part of the firm at any point, but he is important also, correct?
Yes. Mr. Walden historically started or was the premier founder of the GATE, G-A-T-E, City Bar Association. Historically, Atlanta has been known as the Gate City to the south. And the Gate City Bar Association was founded because African Americans were prohibited from joining the Atlanta Bar Association and also the Georgia Bar Association, which is now called the State Bar of Georgia. And he founded that organization along with other lawyers to promote, to enhance the practice of law with African American lawyers, to assure that African American lawyers had an opportunity to get help from each other. Historically, they met at Pascal's, the old Pascal's on Martin Luther King, once a month, and probably was at a dinner once a month, and the lawyers individually would ask, now what should we do on a particular case like this? And so each meeting was a continuing legal education occasion, where it was just not a social, let's have dinner, but it was a meeting to promote and advance the practice of law in a small group, because there were not a lot of lawyers, African American lawyers at that time.
Now, two other names that I wasn't familiar with was Mr. Alexander, and Mr. Reiskoff.
William Alexander became a partner of the law firm of Halliwell, Ward, Moore, then Halliwell, Ward, Moore, then Moore, Alexander, Halliwell, Ward, Moore, Alexander. Mr. Alexander also Well, he was a very quiet person, a
Okay,
very
what
quiet
was his
person.
full name? I don't.
William Alexander. He was very quiet. In fact, when I clerked in the office, many times I didn't even know that Bill Alexander was in the office. He was that quiet. He was very quiet. He kept to himself. He shut his door, and the whole conversation would be Mr. Moore, Mr. Renskoff at that time, and the secretaries. And many times Mr. Alexander was just a very quiet person. He later was appointed as a Superior Court judge with the Atlanta Judicial Circuit or Fulton County. Unfortunately, he has passed. Howard Moore is still alive, and of course, Howard Moore, my job with that firm at that time, I was a law student civil rights research intern. I was at law school in Rutgers University in New Jersey, which had a historically known as a constitutional litigation law school. And I was hired by Mr. Halliwell's firm, which really was Howard Moore, William Alexander, and Peter Renskoff, to work upon graduation from Rutgers University Law School. Now, Peter Renskoff that you asked about was a Caucasian lawyer, and he was brilliant, a brilliant lawyer, a tremendous writer. Unfortunately, Peter died several years later in an automobile accident. I was unfortunately, very unfortunately, not able to accept the position at the law firm because Howard Moore accepted the position of representing Angela Davis in California. So I went to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund national headquarters in New York to speak to the president, the director, and asked for an assignment. And he said, absolutely not. Your position is with Mr. Howard Moore. So Mr. Moore was representing Angela Davis. So I called my father, Reverend Potter, and asked him, did he have the letter still from the Justice Department, Civil Rights Division, that I had been accepted for a position? He said he did. So therefore, I accepted that second position as an attorney, as an honor law graduate from the U.S. Attorney Honor Law Graduate Program, and worked for the Civil Rights Division in the Department of Justice. I continued, however, communication with the law firm of Halliwell, Ward, Moore, and Alexander. And in fact, Mr. Halliwell hired me to work in the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, of which he became regional director and then later regional attorney.
Wow. So you answered questions 3 or 4 when I asked you what position did you hold when you worked at the law firm and then how you interacted with the lawyers.